Hello everyone, in this week's video I'm going to be talking about my process for creating my webcomic / webtoon. Some of you may know my webcomic, My Next Door Neighbors. I post it here on YouTube and I also post it on the app Webtoon, but I'm not very good about updating on there and I apologize for that. I'll be posting a new chapter here on YouTube the day after this video is posted, so if you want to catch up, I'll put a link to the playlist in the description. While I'm talking, you'll be watching me draw a panel from My Next Door Neighbors, so let's get started. Step 1. Story. So to be able to make a webcomic, you need some kind of story. If you're not much of a writer, you may want to work with a friend or someone that has a story written already. I'm not an amazing writer, but I like to push myself to make my own characters and stories since I find it really fun. People often ask me if I write the story as I go or if I have the entire plot planned out. For My Next Door Neighbors, I've written as I go. When I first started, I would write out 3 chapters, and then as I worked on those 3 chapters, I would write the next 3 chapters. As I have developed My Next Door Neighbors, I now write many chapters in advance since the story is getting more complicated and there are more characters. Even though I write My Next Door Neighbors as I go, I've always had a rough idea of how I want it to end. The idea of how I want it to end does change as the story evolves, but the concept pretty much stays the same. If you choose to write as you go, I recommend to always be thinking about the ending. That way you always know what you're trying to make your story build towards. Not everyone writes comics as they go. Some people like to have the story finished and set in stone before they illustrate it. I think if you plan to have a really complicated story, you may want to go this route. Since I am an artist first and a writer second, I get a little bored in the writing stage if I don't get to draw anything. I lose motivation and I often end up just dropping the project altogether. So working on the comic as I write it works well for me. It all depends on what works for you. Step 2. Script. For me, scripts are a very important part of creating my comics. This is where I plan all the dialogue and on what pages the events will happen. Here's an example of what my scripts usually look like. First, I'll have a summary of what will happen in the chapter. This helps me keep track of what I want to happen. I don't go into much detail, I just touch on the major points. Then I have the script. I put the character's name, a colon symbol, and then write their dialogue. I break up the dialogue into pages. Each chapter of My Next Door Neighbors is about 30 pages, so I try to keep the chapters around that length. If they get longer than that, I have a hard time staying on schedule. I also write details for things that are not said, like establishing shots or how a character's face looks. For me, sometimes things will change from the script to the storyboarding phase, mostly because I'll often not be able to fit as much onto the page as I thought I could, or just because I feel like things will flow better if I break it up onto different pages. If you are the writer and the artist and aren't working for a company, you don't need to stress too much if you don't perfectly follow the script. For me, the script is to help me get a good idea of what I want to do, not set things in stone. However, if you're working with a writer, you'll probably want to consult with them before making changes. Also, if you are a writer working with an artist, you'll probably want to get more detailed with your script so the artist knows what to do. Storyboarding is when you do rough, simple sketches to help you plan out where you want panels, characters, and speech bubbles to go. While doing this, I heavily rely on the script I made earlier. If I didn't have the script, this process would take way longer and be way more confusing. My storyboards are often just little stick figures. A lot of times I'm the only one who can understand them. If you're working with a writer, you probably want to make them a little clearer and more detailed. My webcomic is formatted for YouTube. I have a page preset I made in Clip Studio Paint. I make it have a border along the edges, that way I can have the panels and the speech bubbles can kind of go outside of the panels. While working on My Next Door Neighbors, I make the resolution higher than needed. That way if I need to print My Next Door Neighbors at a larger size, I can. I recommend working at a larger canvas size than needed because you can always scale the canvas down, but you can't really scale it up unless you're working with vector art. But at the same time, you don't want to make your canvas too large. For one of my comics, I made my workspace really large, but then when I scaled it down, it looked a little odd because some details don't translate as well at the lower resolutions. And so you probably don't want to make it like too big. So for the pages of My Next Door Neighbors, I have them as a 16:9 aspect ratio, and they are scaled up from 1920 by 1080. That way when I scale them down, I can easily scale them to 1920 by 1080. For things like Webtoon, they allow 800 pixels wide by 1280 pixels long. So for My Next Door Neighbors, I just scale it down smaller and then upload it like that. So if you're working on a comic for Webtoon, you want to make sure that you can scale down to this size, or place your panels within something this size. Step 4, speech bubbles. After storyboarding, I'll add the speech bubbles. Sometimes. I get impatient and I go straight into making the art, and then I'll add the speech bubbles later. However, I recommend adding the speech bubbles first since they may take up more or less space than expected. For the word balloons, I use the preset ones in Clip Studio Paint, but I know some artists like to create their own. For the font, I use Tecton Pro. I like to use fonts that aren't super stiff like Times New Roman and Arial. No, I prefer fonts that aren't super stiff. Some artists like to create their own fonts. I'm not sure how they go about doing that, but it may be something you want to look into. Step 5, the art. Now, if you are the artist, this is probably the part you have been waiting for. After so much preparation and planning, you can finally bring the comic to life. All artists have their own process for how they illustrate the comic. Some artists sketch the entire chapter, then ink the entire chapter, and then color the entire chapter. If I worked like this, I think I'd get really bored, so this is how I work. Day 1, sketch 2 pages. Day 2, ink and color one of the pages. Day 3, ink and color one page and sketch another page. I then repeat day 3 until I finish the chapter. I like to ink and color a page and then sketch another page on the same day. For a long time, I would sketch 2 pages one day and then ink and color those 2 pages the next day. But this was really uneven when it came to how long I'd be working on the comic each day. The sketch days wouldn't take me very long since I was just sketching, but then the inking and coloring days would take me so much longer because I was inking and coloring the panels. So I found this new workflow to be much more balanced. I don't like to ink and color a sketch the same day I draw it because sometimes things will look weird but I won't notice until the next day. Now my process isn't always the same for every page. Sometimes it depends on what I'm drawing or what's going on in the comic. Sketching. For simple pages or chibis, I'll often have one sketch layer. For normal pages, I'll do 2 sketch layers, a rough one and a cleaned up one. For pages that I want to be super fancy because they are important, I'll do 3 sketch layers. Rough, clean up, and extra clean up. I couldn't find any examples that wouldn't show spoilers, but I know I do it sometimes. Line art. For simple pages or chibis, I'll use pretty thick line art. For normal pages, I'll use my standard line art thickness. For fancy pages, I'll use slightly thinner line art to make things look a little prettier. I find inking with thinner line art takes me longer, that's why I'll only use it on fancy panels. Coloring. For the most part, my coloring stays pretty similar in the entire comic. Step 1, base coloring. I use the magic wand tool and color the entire page with its colors. Step 2, shading. I take my shading color and make a new layer set to multiply above all my other coloring layers. Then I add shading where I want it. If it's a normal panel, I use a magenta color for the shading. If it's a sad or dramatic panel, I'll use a dark blue. The eyes are very important to me, so I do a lot of shading on them. I do a base color, shading, then a highlight along the bottom, and then add highlights. I'll also add blue shading across the top of the eye and set it to multiply. I'll also add little white dots in the hair for highlights. If the panel is fancy, I'll add more soft shading and highlights to the page. And after I do all of that, the page is finished. But now I have to get it ready for YouTube. So first I have to export the pages. I go to File, Export, Multiple Pages, and then Batch Export. And these are the settings I export it at. I really don't know what I'm doing. I just played around with the settings until it turned out okay. Once I have the pages exported, I import them into Premiere Pro, and then put them in order and calculate how long each page should stay on the screen. Then I add music. I use music from the YouTube audio library for my webcomics. I find adding music is a fun touch, and many people requested it when I didn't have music in the first chapter. Then I upload the video, create the thumbnail, and it's done. For uploading to Webtoon, my process is pretty much the same. I just export my next door neighbors at a smaller size. Before I end this video, I want to say thank you so much to my patrons, including Rachel, Andrew, Swinky, Now from Academy of Games, Lucille, Robert, Tamalam, Pizzotera, Ann, Magic Gamer Dad, Eduardo, AJ, Nikki, Michael, Adam, Narichan, Daniel, Panda Bear, Daniel, Aaron, and Patrick. Thank you so much for being a patron and for your support. So that is my process for creating my next door neighbors. I hope this video was helpful and that you enjoyed it. Like I mentioned earlier, if you want to check out my next door neighbors, there's a link to the playlist in the description. I'll be posting a new chapter tomorrow. So I'll see you all tomorrow and next week in my next video. Bye!